All right, let's dive into one of the biggest, toughest questions out there: suffering. But we're going to look at it through a really specific ancient lens, a framework built around this idea of a sovereign permitter. I mean, it's the question we've all asked at some point, right? If God is good, why do good people have to go through so much pain? It just doesn't seem to add up. Well, there's this ancient book that throws out a pretty startling answer. It asks, what if some suffering isn't just random, senseless tragedy? What if it's actually a divinely permitted trial, something allowed to happen to prove that a person's faith is the real deal? And to really get our heads around this idea, we have to start at the very beginning, with the story of Job. Now, this isn't just a simple story about having patience. It's the foundational text for this entire way of thinking about suffering. And right from the get-go, the text makes one thing crystal clear. Job is a good guy, blameless even. And that's absolutely crucial. It immediately tells us that his suffering isn't a punishment for something he did wrong. It's something else entirely. So, the story of Job pulls back the curtain and shows us what's happening behind the scenes. It's like we're stepping into this cosmic courtroom where a case is being made and the rules for a trial are being laid out. And in this cosmic drama, you've basically got three main players. First, there's Job, our righteous sufferer. Then you have the accusing adversary, Satan. And finally, presiding over the whole thing is God, the sovereign permitter, the ultimate judge. Now, to really understand this, we've got to talk about the term ha-Satan. In the book of Job, this isn't a name like Lucifer, it's a title. It literally means the accuser or the adversary. Think of him less like an evil king and more like a celestial prosecuting attorney in God's own court. So, this celestial prosecutor steps up and makes his case. He basically argues that Job's faith is totally fake. It's transactional. He's only faithful because God has given him everything. The accuser's challenge is simple. Take away all the good stuff, and Job will curse God to his face. And this is where we see God's role as the sovereign permitter in action. He says, okay, you can test him, but, and this is a huge but, he immediately sets the boundaries. Satan can touch Job's possessions, but he can't touch Job himself. God is the one in control. Well, round one goes to Job. He loses everything, but he doesn't curse God. So the accuser comes back, and he's not done. He doubles down. He says the real test isn't about property. It's about personal, physical pain. Skin for skin, he says. It's a really cynical argument. Basically, sure, a man can handle losing his stuff, but make him physically miserable, and he'll give up anything, including his faith, just to save his own skin. And once again, God allows the test to get more intense. But notice, he immediately draws another line in the sand. Satan can afflict Job's body, but he absolutely cannot take his life. This just hammers home the central theme. God's control is total, even when things look like they're spinning out of control. Okay, so this whole pattern we see in Job, this permitted trial, it's not just a one-off story. It actually pops up again later in the Bible. But it's so important that we learn to tell it apart from another kind of suffering, straight-up punishment for sin. They're not the same thing. For a perfect example, just look at the Apostle Paul, centuries later. He talks about having a thorn in the flesh. And get this, he calls it a messenger of Satan. Sound familiar? Just like Job, Paul is a righteous guy. The suffering isn't a punishment. It's allowed for a higher purpose. In his case, to keep him humble. And again, the answer Paul gets isn't for the suffering to be taken away. Instead, he gets this incredible insight from God, who tells him, "My strength is made perfect in your weakness." The point wasn't to make Paul comfortable. It was to make him rely completely on God's grace. So let's put these two ideas side by side, because this distinction is critical. On one side, you have Paul's suffering. That's a test, permitted by God to refine his character. On the other side, you have King David's suffering after he pridefully took a census. That was a direct punishment for sin. See the difference? Both involve an adversary, but God's purpose is totally different. All right, everything we've talked about so far has been leading up to this moment. Because when we get to the story of Jesus, this entire pattern we've been tracing doesn't just get fulfilled, it gets flipped completely upside down. Picture the scene, the Last Supper. The ultimate accuser, Satan, is right there in the room. He enters Judas to kick off the greatest trial in human history, the betrayal and death of the Son of God. All the players are on the stage. Now, just to refresh our memory, what was the original pattern from Job? God is in heaven, looking down, and he's the one who grants permission to the accuser. The authority flows from the top down. But now, look at this. It's staggering. In the upper room, it's Jesus, the one about to suffer, who gives the command. He looks at Judas, who is filled with Satan, and says, "What you are about to do, do quickly." He's not just permitting it, he's directing it. This is what we mean by the great inversion. Job was the passive subject of a trial set up by others, but Jesus? He is the active director of his own redemptive sacrifice. He is completely sovereign over his own suffering. He's in the driver's seat. So, when you lay it all out, this whole progression from Job's endurance to Christ's victory, what does it tell us about the ultimate purpose of this kind of permitted suffering? This chart really brings it all together. You can see the whole arc. The person being tested goes from a righteous servant, Job, all the way to the righteous son, Jesus. And the reason for the trial? It shifts from a test of one man's character to what's called vicarious atonement, which is just a fancy way of saying he suffered for others, to save them. And the biggest shift of all is the divine role. It goes from just permitting something to happen to actively directing and commanding it. The outcome isn't just a personal blessing anymore. It's the defeat of the accuser and salvation for everyone. And that leaves us with one last big question to think about. If we start to see our struggles through this lens, not as random, meaningless chaos, but as part of a bigger story, sovereignly guided with a redemptive purpose, how does that change everything about how we understand pain?